In 1945, on a remote Pacific island, a Japanese soldier who had been living in the jungle for months crawled toward an American position with his hands up. He was 40 pounds underweight. His uniform was rotting off his body. His unit had been surviving on snails and roots. The men around him had been dying of starvation and disease for months, not from enemy fire, but from being cut off from supply lines that the American Navy had methodically destroyed. He expected to be shot. That was not a paranoid thought. The Japanese military had told its soldiers explicitly what Americans did to prisoners. It had told them in the field code issued by General Tojo in 1941, which said, plainly, "Do not live in shame as a prisoner." It had told them in training and radio broadcasts, in everything the military had communicated about the nature of the enemy and what capture meant. Surrender was not a military option. It was a death sentence handed to you by the people you surrendered to. So when this man raised his hands and walked toward the American lines, he was doing something that, by everything his government had taught him, should have resulted in his immediate death. What happened instead is the part nobody in Japan knew about yet. He was given food, real food, cooked rice, vegetables, meat. He was given clean water and medical attention. He was taken to a processing facility, searched, documented, and sent to a camp where the daily caloric intake was more than 3 times what he had been living on in the jungle. Back on that island, his former comrades were still fighting, still starving, and still dying because they believed the alternative was worse. This is the story of what Japanese prisoners actually found when they surrendered to the Americans, and it is the story of how that information was one of the most powerful weapons the Allied forces had and one of the most difficult to get anyone to believe: the world they came from. To understand what American captivity meant to a Japanese soldier, you have to understand what the Japanese military had built inside its own men. The Senjin-kun, the field service code issued by War Minister General Hideki Tojo in January 1941, was the document that governed how Japanese soldiers were expected to behave in combat. It covered everything from discipline to unit loyalty to the relationship between the soldier and the emperor. But its most consequential section was the one about capture. It said, in terms that left no room for interpretation, "Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die and leave no ignominious crime behind you." This was not a guideline. It was a code backed by institutional weight, cultural pressure, and the memory of what had happened to Japanese soldiers who were captured in earlier wars and came home. Soldiers who returned from Russian prisoner of war camps after the 1905 war had been treated as social outcasts. The message their experience sent was unambiguous. Captivity was not a pause in your military career that you recovered from. It was the end of your identity as a Japanese soldier and the end of your social existence in Japan. By 1941, this framework had been reinforced by years of military training, Shinto nationalism, and propaganda that fused the emperor with the nation in a way that made personal survival feel selfish. Dying for the emperor was not a tragedy. It was the highest possible purpose. Surviving an enemy captivity was not resilience. It was simply a failure. The practical result of this was something that Allied commanders had to account for from the first engagements in the Pacific. Japanese soldiers, in overwhelming numbers, chose death over surrender. They charged Allied positions with bayonets when their ammunition ran out. They detonated grenades against their own bodies rather than be taken. On Saipan in 1944, Japanese civilians, not soldiers, civilians, jumped from cliffs into the sea because they had been told by the military that Americans would torture and kill them. Thousands of them went off those cliffs. The numbers that came out of this policy were stark. During the entire Second World War, less than 3% of Japanese military personnel surrendered, and of those who did, the majority were so severely wounded, sick, or starved that they were physically incapable of further resistance when they were taken. In many engagements, there were simply no Japanese survivors at all. Not because the Americans left no one alive, because the Japanese military had constructed a system in which dying was the default choice, and living in captivity was not a real option that men considered. What was happening to the men who kept fighting? While all of this was happening on the surface, the ideology, the code, the willingness to die, something else was happening underneath it that the Japanese military command understood but could not fully solve. The Imperial Japanese Army was starving. By 1943, American submarines had begun systematically destroying Japanese merchant shipping. Japan was an island nation that imported the majority of its food, raw materials, and fuel. Every ship that went to the bottom took supplies that could never be replaced at the rate they were being lost. By 1944, the American submarine campaign had become devastatingly effective. Japanese shipping losses were running at rates that made normal supply chains impossible to maintain. The home islands were already under strict food rationing. Children's daily rations had dropped from 19 ounces to 14 ounces between 1943 and 1945. By 1945, the average Japanese civilian was consuming less than 80% of the minimum caloric intake needed for basic health. For Japanese soldiers on Pacific islands that had been cut off from resupply, and by 1944 and 1945 there were hundreds of thousands of them, the situation was catastrophic. The American strategy of island hopping deliberately bypassed some heavily garrisoned Japanese positions and left them isolated. The garrisons on those bypassed islands were not reinforced, not resupplied, and not evacuated. They were left to hold their positions and die of starvation, disease, and the grinding attrition of fighting in tropical environments with no logistical support. In New Guinea, the Japanese 18th Army fought for years in terrain that was so hostile and so thoroughly cut off from supply that 79% of the army did not survive the war. The vast majority of those deaths were not from combat. They were from starvation and tropical disease, malaria, dengue fever, scrub typhus, dysentery. Soldiers who had been fighting in the Pacific jungles for 2 and 3 years were subsisting on whatever they could find in an environment that offered very little. Snails, snakes, roots, bark. Men who had entered the war as healthy young conscripts were walking corpses by 1944. Even after those survivors surrendered to Australian forces in September 1945, more than 1,000 of the 13,000 men who had made it that far died in the weeks after surrender, not from enemy action, but from conditions their bodies could no longer recover from. They had been starving for so long that rescue came too late for 1 in 13 of them. The pattern repeated across the theater. On Guadalcanal, Japanese soldiers toward the end of the campaign were too weak to hold their rifles. Japanese commanders in their own field reports documented the physical deterioration, soldiers unable to march, unable to dig, unable to function as a military force, dying in their positions not from Allied fire, but from the compounding effects of malnutrition and tropical disease that a functional supply system would have prevented. The American forces who found these positions sometimes couldn't distinguish between the living and the dead. On the bypassed islands, Rabaul, Truk, Wewak, entire garrisons numbering in the tens of thousands were left in place by the island hopping strategy, cut off and unable to meaningfully affect the war's outcome. They died in place, not in battle, in slow attrition from a war that had functionally moved past them and left them to rot. Of the 2.3 million Japanese military dead across the entire war, historians estimate that approximately 1.4 million, more than half, died from starvation or diseases directly linked to malnutrition rather than from enemy fire. This figure sits in the records and tends to stop people when they read it. The army that had seemed so relentless, so willing to throw itself against Allied positions without regard for losses, was losing most of its men not to Allied bullets, but to the gap between what the supply system could deliver and what the men needed to survive. What they found when they surrendered: Japanese soldiers who did surrender, who were so exhausted, sick, or near death that the calculus of dying in the jungle versus raising their hands had finally tipped, found something they had not been prepared for. Before capture, 84% of Japanese prisoners had expected to be tortured and killed after surrendering, according to interrogation surveys conducted by Allied military intelligence. This was not irrational. It was the logical conclusion of everything their military had told them about the enemy and everything they understood about how Japan treated prisoners, because the way Japan treated Allied prisoners gave them a clear model of what captivity could look like. The reality of American camps was the precise opposite of what they had been taught to expect. The United States held its POW operations to the 1929 Geneva Convention, the same document Japan had never ratified and frequently ignored in its treatment of Allied prisoners. American military policy directed that Japanese prisoners be housed in clean facilities, given adequate food and medical treatment, paid for their labor, and not subjected to torture or abuse. The policy was imperfectly applied. There were documented incidents of mistreatment, but the baseline it established was something that Japanese prisoners experienced as genuinely disorienting. The first shock was always the food. Japanese soldiers arriving from starved jungle positions had been living on 1,800 calories a day or less. In American camps, the daily ration was approximately 3,800 calories, more than 3 times what they had been surviving on. The camp diet included meat, vegetables, rice, bread, and protein at quantities these men had not seen in years. For some, the sudden abundance was literally physically difficult to process. Prisoners whose digestive systems had adapted to near-starvation conditions became sick in the first days from eating food that was too rich in too large a quantity. Some initially refused to eat, convinced the food was poisoned. The contrast was something that prisoners wrote about later, the specific absurdity of sitting in front of a meal that would have been extraordinary by the standards of what they had been eating before capture. One account describes a prisoner's first sight of canned meat in an American mess hall, something that, by the standards of what the Japanese military had been providing to men in the field, registered as almost implausible. Not because canned meat was inherently luxurious, but because the gap between that and roots and bark was large enough to feel like a different category of existence entirely. Chocolate was widely available in American camps through the commissary at 10 cents a bar in varieties that most Japanese prisoners had never encountered. Coca-Cola was served at 5 cents a bottle. These were not political statements. They were the ordinary commercial products of a country whose industrial and agricultural output was operating at full wartime capacity, directed partly toward keeping even its enemy prisoners fed and functioning. The scale of American production was itself a form of shock, not just to Japanese prisoners, but to German and Italian prisoners who arrived from Europe and discovered that the country they had been fighting was producing at a level that no amount of propaganda had prepared them to understand. Then came the medical treatment. Malaria, dysentery, beriberi, infections that had been eating through men for months. American military medicine treated these conditions with resources that the Japanese military field system, particularly for men on isolated Pacific islands, could not have provided. For a soldier who had watched men die around him from diseases that went untreated in the jungle, receiving actual medical care was not a small thing. It was the first evidence that the enemy was not performing the specific cruelty that Japanese propaganda had prepared them for. The facilities themselves were another shock. Clean barracks with real beds, hot showers, access to latrines that were not open pits. For men who had been living in foxholes or jungle shelters, sleeping on the ground for months or years, the physical conditions of even a basic military camp represented a standard of living that was almost impossible to process immediately. Some prisoners, in documented accounts, simply sat in their assigned bunks and didn't move for hours, not from weakness, but from something closer to incomprehension at the physical reality around them. Camp Tracy and the intelligence operation. The Americans understood something early in the Pacific War that took a while to translate into policy. Japanese prisoners, when they did surrender, were extraordinarily valuable, not just as prisoners, but as intelligence assets. Because so few of them surrendered, each one who did was likely to have information that was unusual. Officers and senior enlisted men who chose captivity over death were often men of education and technical competence, whose decision to survive meant the Americans had access to people who understood Japanese operations at a level far above what random prisoners usually provided. This understanding produced Camp Tracy, the Byron Hot Springs Hotel in California, a resort that had hosted Clark Gable, Charlie Chaplin, and Mae West in the 1930s, built around natural sulfur springs and mud baths, was converted in 1942 into the most secret Japanese prisoner interrogation facility in the United States. Its official address was P.O. Box 651. Nobody at the facility used its real name in any official communication. The interrogation method at Camp Tracy was built on the opposite of coercion. Prisoners who arrived were housed in rooms on the upper floor of the former hotel, the same rooms that had been available to paying guests a decade earlier. They were given good Japanese food, prepared by cooks who understood the cuisine. They were provided leisure time. They were treated with respect. What they did not know was that every room in the upper floor had been wired with the most sophisticated listening technology available in 1942. The conversations prisoners had in those rooms with each other in Japanese, believing they were unobserved, were recorded in the basement and transcribed by Nisei interpreters, second-generation Japanese Americans whose language skills were essential to the entire operation. The intelligence that came out of Camp Tracy was significant. One prisoner provided detailed information on Japanese naval vessel design, structure, and armaments that proved directly useful to American naval planning. Soldiers captured on Iwo Jima confirmed at Camp Tracy that Japan intended to defend the home islands to the absolute last man in the event of an Allied landing. Intelligence that factored directly into the calculations about whether a mainland invasion was survivable and how many American casualties such an invasion would produce. The approach worked precisely because it was built on comfort rather than pain. Men who had survived capture, who had already made the decision that violated everything they had been taught, and who were then treated decently, were in a psychological state that made them more forthcoming than men who were being tortured. The Nisei interpreters who transcribed those bugged room recordings were themselves in an unusual position. American citizens of Japanese descent, translating the private conversations of Japanese prisoners in a secret hotel in California, in a country that was simultaneously running internment camps for people who looked like them. Their contribution to the intelligence operation was essential and is largely absent from the public history of the war. The leaflet problem. The Americans needed Japanese soldiers to know what captivity actually looked like. This was strategically important for reasons that went beyond simple compassion. Every Japanese soldier who fought to the death on a bypassed island rather than surrender was a soldier who had to be killed by American forces or who died uselessly from starvation when the war was functionally already over for that position. The island-hopping strategy had deliberately left hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers in positions they could not escape. If those soldiers could be convinced to surrender rather than die, it would save American lives and reduce the cost of finishing the Pacific War. The psychological warfare apparatus that General Douglas MacArthur had built, the Psychological Warfare Branch, produced hundreds of millions of leaflets during the Pacific Campaign. Between 1942 and 1945, an estimated 222 million leaflets and news sheets were dropped or distributed across the Pacific theater. The core message of many of them was the same: if you surrender, you will not be killed. The problem was that the message had to overcome years of conditioning that told Japanese soldiers the exact opposite. Prisoners who had surrendered in experienced American camps reported back, both through letters that the Americans allowed them to write and through leaflets that quoted their testimony directly, that the propaganda about American cruelty was false. One leaflet printed prisoner testimony in Japanese. At the present time, there are tens of thousands of our comrades who have taken the same road that I have and who have surrendered to the Americans. They had believed what they heard about American cruelty, and so they were surprised by the treatment they received, which was very different from the Japanese propaganda on the subject. Now, fired with new hope, they are living contentedly. The Americans also produced leaflets that showed photographs, Japanese prisoners eating, working, and resting in clean facilities. The images were real. They showed men who looked healthy and uninjured, not beaten or degraded. For Japanese soldiers living in jungle positions whose entire frame of reference for what captivity meant came from military training and propaganda, seeing those photographs was meant to create a specific kind of cognitive dissonance. What they were being shown didn't match what they had been told. The psychological warfare planners understood that showing was more effective than telling, and the testimony from former Japanese soldiers, printed in Japanese and dropped from planes, carried more weight than American assertions about American generosity. The Office of War Information, analyzing its own leaflet program in 1944, noted explicitly, "The Japanese soldier expects to be tortured if captured, so we must stress good treatment." That line appears in an internal analysis and sums up the entire problem. The Americans were not trying to overcome skepticism. They were trying to overcome certainty, the deep, trained conviction that surrender led to torture and death. Stressing good treatment was necessary precisely because the default assumption was the opposite. One critical insight that Japanese prisoners themselves contributed to the leaflet program was about language. Prisoners reported that the Japanese word for surrender, kafuku, carried such a powerful cultural charge of shame and failure that seeing it in a leaflet made men less likely to act on the message, not more. The word itself triggered the conditioning they had spent years absorbing. The psychological warfare branch shifted its approach, moving away from the word surrender entirely and replacing it with phrases like cease resistance or negotiation. The "I cease resistance, safe conduct" passes were printed and dropped by the millions across the Philippines and other Pacific theaters in 1944 and 1945, framed not as an act of submission, but as a practical decision by a soldier in an impossible situation. The men who designed these leaflets were working against something that had been built into the Japanese military over decades. A single piece of paper dropped from an airplane cannot undo years of ideological conditioning. But it could, in some cases, give a man who was already starving and exhausted and watching his comrades die around him one small additional reason to make a decision his training said was impossible. That was the calculation the psychological warfare planners were working with, not mass conversions, but individual soldiers at the edge of endurance who needed one more push. What the numbers showed, the results of all of this, the camps, the treatment, the leaflets, the propaganda campaign, were real but deeply limited by the scale of what they were working against. In the entire Philippine campaign, approximately 12,000 Japanese troops surrendered, more than in any other single campaign in the Pacific War. In the context of the numbers involved and of what it took to achieve even that result, 12,000 was considered a significant success. The operations in the Philippines represented the largest use of psychological warfare leaflets in the Pacific Theater, with an estimated 28 million leaflets dropped over Luzon alone in a 6-month period. Elsewhere, the numbers were much smaller. In many Pacific battles, Japanese prisoner counts were measured in dozens or single digits, not because the battles were small, but because an army whose culture treated surrender as equivalent to death simply did not produce prisoners at the rate that European armies did. The contrast with Germany was striking. While 50,000 German prisoners a month were flooding into American camps from August 1944 through the spring of 1945 as German forces collapsed, Japanese prisoner totals across the entire Pacific War numbered in the low thousands. At the end of the war, the United States held approximately 4,000 Japanese prisoners against 371,000 German prisoners, and 51,000 Italian prisoners. The ratio says everything about the difference between the two enemies and the two military cultures. The men who stayed behind. And then there were the men who never got the message at all. When Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers across Asia and the Pacific laid down their weapons and went home. But the island-hopping strategy had left pockets of Japanese forces in isolated positions across the Pacific, cut off from communication, living in jungles where news from the outside world was either unavailable or suspected as enemy propaganda. For these men, the surrender never happened, because nobody came to tell them, or because they didn't believe it when they heard it. Hiroo Onoda continued fighting in the Philippine jungle on Lubang Island until 1974, almost 30 years after the war ended. He had been ordered by his commanding officer to conduct guerrilla warfare and never surrender, and he followed those orders through 3 decades of jungle survival. He killed people during those decades, Filipino civilians and police officers who encountered him in the jungle. He was finally reached in 1974 when his former commanding officer, by then an elderly man living in Japan, traveled to the Philippines personally to relieve him of his orders. Only then did Onoda, still in his original uniform, still carrying his still functional rifle, emerge from the jungle and accept that the war was over. Shoichi Yokoi was found in Guam in 1972, 27 years after the war ended, surviving in a hand-dug cave in the jungle. He had made his own clothes from plant fibers. He had hunted and fished and foraged through nearly 3 decades of jungle survival. He had known the war was over for years. He had found leaflets announcing the surrender during the late 1940s, but he had not believed them. Or more precisely, he had not been able to accept the implication of believing them. When he was found by 2 local hunters near the Talafofo River, he was in reasonable physical health. He had adapted, over 27 years, to a life that required him to survive by his own skills in an environment that would have killed most men in months. When he returned to Japan in 1972, he told reporters at the airport, "It is with much embarrassment that I return. Not relief, not happiness. Embarrassment, the word that connected his return to the framework of the Senjin-kun that had governed him for 3 decades. He had survived, and survival was what he was ashamed of. He became a minor celebrity in Japan, spoke publicly about his experience, and lived until 1997. He never fully reconciled the man he had been trained to be with the man the world had become around him while he was in the jungle. Returning to Japan after surrender felt, to a man raised on the Senjin-kun, like a deeper kind of failure than continuing to survive in the jungle. He had his version of the same calculation that Japanese soldiers in 1945 had made when Allied leaflets fell around them. His answer, for 27 years, was that the jungle was preferable to the alternative. The men who came back from the jungle to Japan, whether at the official end of the war or decades later, came back to a country that had been rebuilt in a direction they hadn't anticipated. Post-war Japan had rebuilt on American assistance, American economic policy, and an American written constitution. The emperor, who had been held up as the reason to die, was still on the throne, but had been stripped of divinity by his own radio broadcast of August 15, 1945, in which he told the Japanese people the war had not gone in Japan's favor. A classic understatement that announced to people who had been told for years that surrender was impossible, that surrender had just happened. The story of Japanese POWs in American camps is not a simple story, and it would be wrong to tell it as one. The same United States that fed Japanese prisoners 3 meals a day and gave them medical care had, months earlier, firebombed Tokyo in a raid that killed more people in a single night than the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki. The same Geneva Convention that guaranteed Japanese prisoners decent treatment was being applied to men whose country had never signed it, whose military had allowed 40% of American prisoners in Japanese captivity to die, a death rate that compared to 1% of American prisoners in German camps. The generosity of the American camp system existed alongside a Pacific War that was brutal in ways the European theater, itself no model of restraint, rarely matched. What the story of Japanese prisoners does illustrate, with unusual clarity, is the distance between a government's ideology and the physical reality it creates for its own men. The Japanese military built an institution that was spectacularly effective at producing soldiers who would die rather than surrender. It was less effective at keeping those soldiers fed, supplied, and alive long enough to fight. Of 2.3 million Japanese military deaths, more than 1.4 million came from starvation and disease, a number that represents the gap between what the Japanese supply system could deliver and what the men in the field actually needed. The Americans who ran the POW camps understood, even if they didn't articulate it this way, that the treatment of prisoners was a strategic tool. Men who were treated decently talked. They provided intelligence. They contributed to the psychological warfare operation that was trying to bring other men out of the jungle before they starved. And in a small number of cases, they lived to go home, to Japan, or in the post-war years to a rebuilt world that looked nothing like the one their military had told them they were dying to defend. The Japanese soldier who crawled out of that jungle in 1945, hands raised, expecting to be shot, and who found food, water, and a bed instead, had survived something that most of his comrades had not. He had broken a code that his government had embedded in him since childhood, and the thing waiting on the other side of that break was not the death he had been promised. The men who kept fighting, who kept dying in those jungles and on those bypassed islands, did so inside a system that gave them no honest information about what the alternative looked like. The leaflets told them, the photographs told them, the testimony of their captured comrades told them. But a government that tells its soldiers the enemy will torture and kill them, and then sends those soldiers into positions with no food and no resupply and no hope of relief, is not a government that can be trusted to give them honest information about anything. The men dying on those islands had no reason to believe the leaflets. They had every reason to believe what they had been taught. And so they stayed in the jungle and they starved, while their comrades in American camps ate 3 meals a day and waited for a war to end that was already, for everyone who could see clearly, long over. That gap between what the Japanese military told its soldiers the world was and what the world actually was cost more than 1 million men their lives, not from enemy action, from starvation and disease in positions they had been trained to hold at all costs, for a government that had already decided those positions were strategically irrelevant. For a story about captivity, that's the part that stays with you longest. If this is the kind of history that doesn't get told, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. It helps more than you think. See you in the next one.